Rain came down in sheets, turning Johannesburg's neon into smeared reflections. Mandisa Daniels walked home with her shoulders hunched against the cold. Exhaustion braided into every step after a double shift. Hillbrow at midnight smelled of diesel and iron. It was the kind of place that taught you how to listen for danger. 3 gunshots cut the air. She froze, heart ricocheting like a trapped bird. Instinct curled her body behind a low brick wall as headlights cut past, and a black SUV vanished around the corner. Silence swelled, heavy, waiting. Then she heard the other sound. A low, broken groan that didn't belong to the street. Mandisa peered around the wall. Under the jaundiced street lamp, a figure lay half in the gutter, a white shirt blooming into dark red. He was big, broader than the men she treated at the emergency unit, muscles folded like coiled rope. Tattoos spiraled up his neck beneath a torn collar. Rain traced black patterns across the ink. His face was slate pale, jaw slack, a thin line of blood at his temple. She shouldn't move. She should call it in, wait for help. But the nurse in her rose before the woman who feared the consequences. She crossed the street, boots splashing in the runoff, and knelt beside him. 2 fingers to his neck found a pulse. Faint, thread-like. But there. "Come on," she said to the night more than to him, ripping her scarf into strips. The bullet had punched through near his ribs. The wound gaped and soaked. She pressed the cloth to it and kept pressure, humming a sterile mantra in her head because if she didn't act she'd become frozen with the kind of guilt that lived for years. The street was empty. No one returned. No sirens. After a minute that felt like an hour, she hoisted him with a kind of desperate strength that surprised her and dragged him to her car. He was heavier than he looked, and his breath came in jagged, shallow slashes. Every movement made a soft curse escape him in a language she didn't know. She drove with the heater full blast and the wipers a frantic metronome. In the car, he slipped in and out of consciousness. One moment a near-death stillness, the next a faint whisper of sound. At a traffic light she thought she smelled smoke on his clothes. At another instant his fingers tightened reflexively on her sleeve like a man clinging to a rope. At home, Mandisa moved with clinical efficiency and an undertone of fear. She cleared a space on the couch, stripped his ruined shirt away, and set to work. She cleaned the wounds, stuffed soaked gauze where it would staunch the bleeding, and stitched what she could with trembling hands. She had no legal right to do this. Taking a gunshot victim into her apartment was technically reckless, possibly illegal, but she could not imagine leaving him to wait for a slow end on that street. Hours passed. The rain became the clock. She watched his chest rise and fall. His face was a landscape of damage and striking angles. At times he muttered in a voice that scraped like gravel, words she couldn't place. Once he tightened his jaw and took one long, shuddering breath as though riding out a nightmare. When dawn finally crawled toward the windows, Mandisa's eyes burned from lack of sleep. He hadn't regained consciousness. His skin had warmed from near death to a fragile cool. The hospital would have done a better job. She told herself that as if the thought could absolve her. But calling the ambulance would have brought questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Where did he come from? Who shot him? Why had she hidden him? So she kept vigil instead. A kettle hissing on the stove, an extra blanket over him, and a stack of sterile supplies lined like a small army on her dining table. At one point she pressed her forehead to the crook of his shoulder and allowed herself a private, exhausted sigh. He breathed in a long, steady inhale and then exhaled without waking. For now, his secret stayed locked behind the hush of unconscious eyes. Outside the city came a wake. The day roared on without caring. Inside her small flat, under a threadbare blanket, the stranger slept on like a bomb that hadn't yet been triggered. Mandisa didn't know his name. She didn't know the blood on his hands or the enemies that followed shadows. She only knew she had made a choice that would change the map of her life. When his eyelids finally fluttered open, the room smelled of boiled tea and disinfectant. The light had shifted. Late morning sun slanted between curtains. Mandisa was dozing in an armchair, an arm draped over a folded towel. The sight of the stranger's eyes opening jolted her awake. He looked at her like a man assessing a threat. For a moment there was only silence. his breathing even but deliberate, her pulse thudding loud enough she felt it in her teeth. He sat up slowly, testing the motion, the pain flaring across his ribs. He clenched his jaw and didn't wince outwardly, as if pain was something to be acknowledged privately. "Where?" he began, his voice hoarse but steady. He was fully conscious now, eyes sharp and measuring. "Where am I?" Mandisa swallowed and kept her voice level, professional. "You're in my apartment. You were shot last night. I found you in the street and brought you here." He blinked as if cataloging the room. The small cabinet of medicines, the tea kettle, the hospital bandage she'd left on the table. He noticed the sterile strips on his side and the crude stitches at the wound. He frowned at them, not in disdain but with the appraisal of someone who understood bodies and tactics. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. Not an accusation, a statement. "Why?" Her fingers tightened around the mug she'd poured for him. She kept her tone practical, the way she did with patients. There could be no assumptions here. "Hospitals. Ask questions," he finished for her. His gaze cut to the window. "Expose things." Mandisa's jaw worked. "I did it because you were bleeding out on the street. Because I couldn't leave you." She said the last part softer, as if confessing something private. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The room filled with the low hum of the refrigerator and a far-off car horn. He sat up more, the motion making him wince but not cry out. He flexed his fingers in front of him, like a man testing a prosthetic. There was a discipline about him, a muscle-coiled readiness. Someone who had been trained to survive. "You are not local," Mandisa observed. She'd noticed the cadence of his vowels while he muttered in unconsciousness. She'd heard the tape of language in the shapes of his throat. "Where are you from?" A flicker, barely visible, crossed his face. He didn't answer directly. "Wrong place, wrong time," he said instead. "What is your name?" "Mandisa Daniels." She returned the question without inflection. "Nurse at the district hospital." There was a tiny change when he said her name, like the click of a lock engaging. "Mandisa." He repeated it with care, testing the shape of the sound. "Han Jun 1, he said at last, giving a name that felt foreign on his tongue. Her breath snagged at the sound. The name meant nothing to her yet, but the measured way he offered it had the weight of a shield. A name used to claim territory and command respect. She kept her face neutral. "Is that your name?" she asked. "Yes." He let the single syllable hang. "If names matter to you, that's what I answer with." She studied him. He did not speak of the men who shot him, nor of why he was on Johannesburg streets bleeding under a lamplight. He answered with composure and with small truths and larger silences. He seemed to be feeling his way through a world he hadn't meant to be in. Mandisa moved to check the bandages as she would any patient, gentle but methodical. "You need to rest. No moving around. I can make you an appointment." "No hospital." He cut her off, sharp but not unkind. "Too many questions. I am not ready for that." He paused, looking at her with eyes that were neither pleading nor commanding but intensely private. "You won't tell anyone." Mandisa felt the old professional reflex, duty to report, to ensure legal safety, clashing with something else she couldn't yet define. For now, she chose the path she'd started down. Quiet protection. "I won't," she said. "But I need to know if you're allergic to anything. Any medical history I should be aware of." He considered. "None that matters," he said finally. "I remember being taken. I remember the gunfire." He closed his eyes for a breath, then opened them again like steel being drawn. "I remember being left." Mandisa listened and filled the forms in her head. A patient with unknown identity, unknown enemies, and loyalty to no one. There was a coldness there, a man who had been betrayed and who, she had the distinct impression, might betray in turn if it served him. And yet he was hurt, very human underneath the danger. She kept her hands busy, checking temperature, palpating pulse, writing down notes. Professional distance was a thin veneer. The human beneath it kept peeking through. She reminded herself of the rules she'd learned in nursing school. Assess, stabilize, then transfer. But transfer to whom? If he refused the hospital, if he had enemies close at hand, the choices were fewer and darker. Hours later, he sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket with a mug between his palms. He watched her when she moved, watched with the same calm assessment that had been there since he'd opened his eyes. He was alert now in a way that made Mandisa keep her hand near the phone and her mind cataloging exits. "Why did you risk your life for a stranger?" he asked suddenly. The question was direct. There was no judgment in it, only interest. Mandisa didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, "Because it was the right thing." She met his gaze. "Because if I could help, I would." He studied her for a long time, as if searching for fissures in her reason. Then he said, almost softly, "You will pay a price for that." She felt the words settle between them like a forecast. "No," she replied before his meaning could be fully born. "I won't. Not for doing the only thing I know how to do." His jaw tightened, but he did not argue further. Outside, afternoon light moved across the floor. Inside a small Johannesburg flat, a fragile truce held between a nursing woman who kept death at bay with warmth and a man who had built his life on other things entirely. He was conscious now. The world had just grown a little more dangerous, and Mandisa understood, with a nurse's clarity and a citizen's fear, that their quiet days together would be measured not in breaths but in the moments before the next storm. 3 days had passed since the stranger opened his eyes, and already Mandisa's small apartment felt too crowded with him in it. He didn't talk much, only enough to answer direct questions. He ate sparingly, slept lightly, and moved like someone who didn't trust the ground beneath his feet. But even without words, his presence filled every corner of the room. He had a soldier's precision. He folded his blanket every morning without being asked. He cleaned his blood from the floor the moment he was strong enough to stand. He even fixed her broken door lock without permission, which, for some reason, unsettled her more than it comforted her. It was the quietness that got to her. He made silence sound like a secret. That afternoon, Mandisa came home from the clinic early. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and boiled tea. He was sitting at her table, shirtless, rewrapping his bandage, the muscles in his back moving like cords beneath skin marred by scars. For a moment, she just stood at the door, her nurse's instinct caught between clinical observation and something she didn't want to name. Then her gaze caught the tattoo on his upper back. A black dragon, curling down his shoulder blade, its tail disappearing beneath the bandage. It wasn't the sort of design people picked out of a magazine. The lines were sharp, ancient, and purposeful, more emblem than decoration. "You missed a spot," she said finally, breaking the spell. He turned slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers. "You're home early. I had to switch shifts." She walked to the table and gestured at the bandage. "You'll reopen the wound if you keep twisting like that." "I've had worse." She frowned. "I'm sure you have, but not in my house. Sit still." He didn't argue. He just sat quietly while she unwound the soiled bandage and replaced it with a clean one. His skin was warm under her gloves. The scent of her antiseptic mixed with his, something faintly metallic, faintly foreign. When she was done, she stepped back. "Who taught you to stitch yourself like that?" "Necessity," he said. "That's not an answer." He glanced at her, lips twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Neither is your question." Mandisa exhaled in frustration. "Look, I don't care about your business or who you are, but if people come looking for you, they'll come here. And I can't." "They won't," he interrupted softly. "How can you be so sure?" His eyes lifted, calm and absolute. "Because they think I'm dead." Mandisa froze. The way he said it, not as relief but as strategy, chilled her. He looked away first, fingers tracing the edge of the table. "You should stop worrying. When I'm strong enough to leave, you'll never see me again." There it was, the wall she hadn't asked for but somehow expected. She nodded, more to herself than to him. "Good, because I didn't sign up for this." But the lie sat bitter on her tongue. Because some part of her, the part that woke to check his breathing in the middle of the night, already cared more than she should. That evening, she made soup. He ate in silence, his posture too straight for someone still healing. Then her phone rang. Mandisa answered, half listening as her colleague Lindio chattered on. But out of the corner of her eye, she noticed him, the stranger listening, not idly, but attentively, his eyes flicking to the window, the clock, the small mirror by the door. He was cataloging the room like he expected an ambush. When the call ended, she set her phone down. "You do that often," she said. He looked up. "Do what?" "Scan. Measure. You're always watching. Even when you pretend not to." He said nothing for a long time. Then, "Old habit." "What kind of habit?" He met her gaze. Steady, impenetrable. "The kind that keeps you alive." Her stomach turned cold before she could reply. A distant noise broke the moment. A car pulling up outside. Heavy tires, slow idle. He was on his feet instantly, moving to the window, his movements quiet but lethal. Mandisa's heart pounded as he peeked through the blinds, body tense. "It's just my landlord," she said, her voice unsteady. He didn't relax. Not until the car door slammed and footsteps faded. Then he drew a breath and turned away. "Sorry," he said simply. Mandisa stared at him, trying to reconcile the contradiction. The man who apologized for scaring her, but whose every muscle promised violence. "Who are you really?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a long time, then said, "Someone who was betrayed," and before she could ask what that meant, he turned and walked back to the couch, shutting the conversation down like closing a door. That night, Mandisa lay awake long after the lights were out. Somewhere across the room, she could hear his breathing, steady, controlled, as if even in sleep, he refused to rest completely. She stared at the ceiling, every instinct warring with reason. Whoever he wasn't safe. And yet, for reasons she couldn't explain, she couldn't bring herself to make that call. Because beneath all that silence, she had seen something human flicker behind those dark, guarded eyes. A shadow of pain that didn't belong to a stranger. She told herself it was pity. She told herself it would pass. But deep down, Mandisa knew better. This wasn't just a wounded man hiding in her home. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. By the fifth morning, the stranger was strong enough to move without flinching. Mandisa found him outside, standing barefoot on the small balcony, the weak Johannesburg sunlight touching the scars along his shoulders. He was looking down at the street like he was memorizing every car, every sound, every possible escape route. "Your body's healing fast," she said quietly from behind him. He turned, eyes scanning her face before he nodded once. "You did a good job. I'm a nurse. That's what I do. Not for strangers who bleed on their floor," he replied. There was no accusation in his tone, just fact. Mandisa folded her arms. "You would have died if I left you there." He studied her for a moment, then said simply, "You shouldn't have helped me." "Too late," she said, brushing past him. "You're my problem now." That day was long. She cleaned the clinic storage room, answered impatient patients, and returned home exhausted. But when she opened her door, something unusual happened. The floor was spotless. Her broken kitchen shelf, the one she'd been too tired to fix for weeks, stood repaired, and on the stove, a small pot simmered with the scent of ginger and garlic. Mandisa blinked, confused. "Did you?" He was sitting at the table, quietly spooning broth into a bowl. "You skipped lunch again," he said without looking up. "I didn't ask you to cook." "You didn't need to." She hesitated. "You're cooking for me now?" He lifted his gaze, that faint, unreadable look again. "It's repayment. For saving your life? For trusting a man you shouldn't." The words sank deep. She sat across from him, tasting the soup in silence. It was rich and balanced. Too refined for a man who'd called himself nobody. She caught herself watching his hands, scarred, capable, precise. The way he handled the spoon, the way his wrist bore the faint outline of an old burn mark. He caught her staring and set his bowl down. "What? You don't move like a regular man," she said. "You move like someone trained to disappear." He didn't answer. His eyes drifted to the clock on the wall. Sometimes disappearing is the only way to survive. Later that evening, as the rain began to fall, the power went out. Another blackout. Mandisa fumbled for candles. "Stay there," he said, his voice calm but firm. In 2 minutes, he had the emergency lamp glowing faintly. "How do you know your way around my apartment so well?" she asked, half joking. "Observation. That's not creepy at all," she muttered, earning the faintest curve of his mouth. They sat in the dim light, the sound of rain filling the silence. "You said you were betrayed," Mandisa began softly. "By who?" He didn't look at her. "By people I built everything with." "That sounds painful." He gave a dry laugh. "Pain doesn't begin to cover it." "Did you love them?" That made him look up. "Once." The answer was quiet. Too quiet. Mandisa didn't push further. She just poured him tea, her hands brushing his briefly as she passed the cup. For a split second, the world seemed to still. It wasn't attraction. Not yet. Just a pulse of awareness neither could ignore. Hours later, when the rain stopped, Mandisa found herself watching him again as he slept on the couch. His face half-shadowed, but softer than before. He looked younger like that. Human. Not the man who'd frightened her with his cold stares and quiet strength, but someone who carried ghosts heavier than his wounds. She tucked a blanket around him. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. "Whoever you are," she whispered, "I hope you find peace." The next morning, before dawn, a sound jolted her awake. Not loud, but sharp. A phone buzz. A vibration. She followed the noise to the kitchen. There, on the counter, beneath his folded jacket, something glowed faintly. A small black phone, the kind used for private communication. It vibrated once more, and she froze. The message flashed for 2 seconds before the screen dimmed. "Target confirmed. Sole orders stand. Eliminate all liabilities." Mandisa's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the couch, where he still slept, one hand under the pillow. Too still, too quiet. Her heart pounded as realization hit her like cold water. Whoever he was, he wasn't running from danger. He was the danger. The phone was still in her hand when he moved. Not much, just the subtle shift of muscle, the kind that made her realize he hadn't been asleep at all. Mandisa froze. "Put it down," he said quietly. His voice rough from disuse but sharp enough to cut through the air. She turned slowly. "What is this? Who are you?" He rose from the couch, slow, deliberate, every movement controlled. The man she'd bandaged and fed only days ago now looked like someone entirely different. Shoulders squared, expression cold, eyes void of pain. "Give me the phone. You said people thought you were dead," she whispered. "Now you're getting messages about eliminating targets?" He stopped a few feet away. "Mandisa, don't say my name like that," she snapped, her hands trembling. "You've been lying to me from the start." "I didn't lie. You didn't tell the truth either." The tension hung heavy, the rain outside muffling the sharp edge of their voices. Finally, he exhaled, lowering his tone. "You're right. I didn't. Because the truth gets people killed." She stared at him, her heart pounding. "What truth?" For the first time, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached for the phone and placed it on the table, between them. "You deserve to know who you brought into your home." He poured himself a glass of water, his hand steady, though his eyes weren't. "My name is Jun Ryu," he said at last. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it, like it carried the weight of a nation, made her skin prickle. "I used to run an organization," he continued. "Global. Dangerous. We had control in Hong Kong, Vladivostok, Dubai, London, and Seoul." Mandisa's stomach dropped. "A gang." He met her gaze. "A syndicate. One that built empires, and buried anyone who got in the way." She felt cold all over. "You're—" "Yes," he said simply. "The kind of man you should have left bleeding on that street." Silence. Only the rain spoke. He leaned back, jaw tight. "I was betrayed by my own men. My second in command, a man I treated like blood, sold me out to a foreign buyer. They thought I was dead when they left me in that alley." "And the message?" He looked at her, eyes unreadable. An order. For my killers. Which means they're still working. And if they learn I'm alive. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Mandisa stepped back, breath shaky. So you're saying the people who tried to kill you might come here? Yes. Then you need to leave. He shook his head. Not yet. If I move too early, they'll trace me. I need to find out who's running my network now. She stared at him. You talk about all this like it's business. He looked down at his hands. It was my business. My life. And how many people did that life destroy? He didn't answer, just stared into nothing. The silence was enough. Hours later, Mandisa sat alone in her room, the truth pressing against her ribs like a stone. She'd saved a killer, a man who carried power, danger, and vengeance in his blood. And now that same blood ran through her home. Yet when she thought of throwing him out, her mind flickered to the image of him fixing her shelf, cooking her soup, saying softly, "You shouldn't have helped me." He was a contradiction. A wounded beast who thanked her, and a predator who could end lives without blinking. She couldn't sleep, not when every sound outside could mean his enemies had arrived. Near dawn, she went to the kitchen for water, and found him awake, sitting by the window, staring into the fading darkness. "You haven't slept," she said quietly. "Couldn't," he replied. "Guilt?" she asked. He glanced at her, something like a flicker of humor in his tired eyes. "Habit." Mandisa hesitated. "Why tell me the truth now?" "Because you saw the message," he said simply. "And because if something happens, I don't want you to die wondering what kind of devil you saved." She crossed her arms. "You talk like you're already planning to leave." "I am." "When?" "As soon as I can walk without bleeding." "And then what? You go back to killing people?" He looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, "No, I go back to take back what's mine." His tone was flat, but beneath it was something dangerous. Cold determination wrapped around old wounds. Mandisa turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "And after that?" Junryu didn't answer. He just stared out the window, the first light of morning catching the scar that ran across his collarbone. For a moment, he looked less like a man, and more like a storm that hadn't yet broken. That day, she packed a small bag for herself, just in case. But when she reached the door, something stopped her. Not logic, not fear, but a strange pull she couldn't explain. Because even though she knew who he was now, what he'd done, she also knew something else. He'd chosen not to hurt her when he easily could have. And that tiny, dangerous mercy was enough to keep her from walking away. It began with a sound too quiet for the hour. A distant click, like metal meeting metal. Mandisa stirred on the couch, half asleep, until she saw him, Junryu, standing in the darkness by the window, shoulders tense, eyes locked on the street below. "What's wrong?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He just raised a finger. Silence. Then she heard it too. Engines. 2, maybe 3. Slow, deliberate idling just beyond the gate. Junryu moved to the table, grabbing the small black phone she'd seen that morning. The screen flashed briefly before he crushed it under his boot. "Get your shoes," he said, calm but urgent. Mandisa blinked, confused. "What?" "They found me." Her stomach turned cold. You said they thought you were dead." "They did," he said, checking the clip of a gun she hadn't known he kept under the couch. "But someone talked." "How?" He looked at her, eyes dark as midnight. "It doesn't matter now. Move." They slipped into the kitchen as lights flooded the street. 3 black SUVs. Tinted windows, headlights cutting through the mist. Mandisa's trembling hand clutched the counter. "Oh God!" He turned to her, voice low but steady. "Listen to me, Mandisa. Whatever happens, you run. Don't stop. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you here. You will if you want to live." Something in his tone, the cold command of someone who'd given that order before, made her freeze. The first door shattered before she could reply. The sound of boots. Shouting. Korean and English mixed, harsh, sharp, professional. Junryu pushed her toward the back door. Now! Bullets tore through the front windows, glass raining over the table. Mandisa screamed, ducking low as he returned fire, his movements fluid and lethal. A storm she hadn't seen before. The quiet, wounded man was gone. In his place stood the wolf they'd come to kill. They burst through the back into the narrow alley. Rain slicked the pavement. Her breath came in ragged gasps as they ran, weaving through shadows. He led her down a side street, firing 2 quick shots over his shoulder. One attacker fell. Another shouted into a radio. "June!" Mandisa cried. "Where are we going? There's a car 2 blocks down. How do you even have?" "Less talking," he snapped, grabbing her wrist as they ducked behind a dumpster. A flashbang exploded near the corner. The world went white. Her ears rang. When her vision cleared, she saw him bleeding again. A line of crimson across his arm, another near his ribs. "You're hurt." "So are they," he said coldly. He pulled her toward a small garage and kicked the door open. Inside sat a black motorcycle, sleek, matte, powerful. "You can't be serious," Mandisa gasped. "Get on." "June, I've never." "Hold on to me and don't look back." Before she could argue, the engine roared to life, the noise swallowing her fear. She wrapped her arms around his waist as they shot into the street, bullets sparking behind them, headlights slicing through the rain. The chase was chaos. Johannesburg's midnight roads flashed by in streaks of gold and shadow. June maneuvered like a man born on the edge of death. Sharp turns, sudden dives, no hesitation. Mandisa clung tighter, her heart pounding against his back. Every time he leaned into the wind, she could feel the heat of him, the raw pulse of danger and defiance. Finally, after what felt like hours, they veered into an abandoned warehouse by the river. He killed the engine, listening. No sound, no pursuit, just rain and breath. Mandisa slid off the bike, shaking. You killed people back there." He looked at her, eyes empty. "They weren't coming to talk." "This is insane," she whispered, stepping back. "You're bleeding again, June." "I've had worse." "You keep saying that," she snapped, tears streaking her face. "But this time you're not alone. You brought me into this." Her voice broke, echoing through the metal walls. He didn't move for a long time. Then, quietly, "I told you not to help me." The words hit like a slap. Mandisa turned away, gripping her arms. "So this is my punishment? Saving the wrong man?" He exhaled, slow, steady, then stepped closer. Not to intimidate, but to steady her. "No," he said softly. "This is mine, for trusting the wrong people." His hand brushed her shoulder. She flinched but didn't pull away. "You need to rest," he murmured. "We'll move before dawn." "Where?" "Somewhere they won't look." Later, as he stitched his own wound under the flickering light, Mandisa watched from the shadows, anger and fear swirling in her chest. But beneath it, something else had begun to grow.
Find out what happens in their relationship in the next episode, which is coming up soon, by clicking on the notification icon. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please do not forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Also, tell us the country you are watching us from in the comments section so that we will make a story for you.